This is the multiple award-winning GardenDC podcast, the podcast about everything gardening in the Washington, D.C. and Mid-Atlantic region. I'm your host, Kathy Jentz. I'm the editor of Washington Gardener magazine. Our content is aimed at gardening enthusiasts, people who grow everything, from edibles to ornamentals, natives to exotics. If it grows in our area, that's what we talk about. Welcome to episode 216 of the GardenDC podcast. In this episode, we talk with Susan Pell, Executive Director of the U.S. Botanic Garden, about plants that fight back. The plant profile is on Christmas cactus, Schlumbergera, and we share what's going on in the garden as well as some upcoming local gardening events and this week's garden tasks in the What's New segment. We close out with the last word on 12 things to grow in your greenhouse from Christy Page of Green Prints. This episode, we're joined by Susan Pell. She is the Executive Director of the U.S. Botanic Garden. Welcome, Susan.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here.
So we're going to talk all about Fierce Flora and how plants protect themselves. But before we get into all of that, we had you on the podcast previously, way back in October 2020. So it's been about 4 years now. So I wanted to get a little update about what's going on with you and the U.S. Botanic Garden.
Absolutely. So it does feel like several lifetimes ago that we spoke. A lot has changed at the garden. So we did celebrate our 200th anniversary, and then we reopened after being closed for quite some time for COVID. And during that closure, we actually took advantage of not having people in the conservatory and made a lot of updates to the conservatory and the tropics house and our primeval garden and several areas throughout. Really did updates, replaced soil in the bed, that kind of thing, and changed some of the collections that are on display in those spaces. We also hired a new curator, Amy Hyland. Really excited about her. She's an expert in Mid-Atlantic native plants and has just really brought a breath of fresh air into our collections and our curation of our collection. And then finally, of course, we have a new exhibit that we just opened, Fierce Flora, Tales of Survival and Demise, that we're going to talk about today.
Excellent. And yeah, we love Amy Hyland here at the GardenDC podcast. We had her on talking all about trilliums in her capacity with Mount Cuba. So we're so happy to hear she's now with U.S. Botanic Garden. And I'll also put a link in our show notes to that 200th anniversary episode we did for the USBG so people can hear all about that history. And so let's go on to our topic of the show, which is the new exhibit that has just opened, and I was there for the media preview and got to check out a little bit about that. But let's let our listeners know first a bit about the U.S. Botanic Garden, especially those who are outside the Washington, D.C. area, and how they can visit.
Absolutely. So we are open every day of the year except for December 25th this year, and we are free to visit. There's no timed entry. You can just come as you please. The conservatory is open from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. every day, and we have a host of outdoor gardens as well. And the gardens around Bartholdi Fountain are open until dusk, but many people come through in the evenings. There's the wonderful lighting in there, and the fountain, of course, is all lit up at night, which is lovely. And so as you come, so the garden is located at the foot of Capitol Hill at the eastern end of the National Mall. And as I said, we're open every single day of the year except for December 25th. And visitors are welcome anytime. We have a lot of different engagement opportunities for people as they come into the conservatory. They may see a discovery cart that's staffed by one of our volunteers. They will certainly be greeted by one of our visitor services experts. And then they can stroll around the conservatory. If they head to the left after they come into the conservatory, they'll get to the East Gallery, and that is where Fierce Flora is located.
Great. And from the preview I attended, I know that it's not just that one room, that kind of is sprinkled throughout the rest of the U.S. Botanic Garden too.
That's absolutely right. So the main part of the exhibit is in the East Gallery, but that is not a space that we can easily grow plants in. And so the living portions of this exhibit are really spread throughout the garden. And sometimes they're identified as being part of Fierce Flora, such as in the area that we call the sort of South Transition area in our South Lobby, has quite a few plants that are planted to really be living demonstration of some of the different characteristics we're talking about in the gallery space. And then right outside of the gallery in our plant adaptations room, we have quite a bit of our carnivorous plant collection, and that is definitely part of this exhibit.
We're going to circle back to those carnivorous plants, but first let's talk a little bit about the exhibit itself. So it is not a temporary one. It's going to be there for a while. So if you're not in the DC area right now, you don't have to run out, but do visit soon. And one of the things I really noticed about it is it's a multi-sensory exhibit. So, and it's for everyone, not just your plant nerds.
Absolutely. I mean, the exhibit really connects to our everyday lives. It talks about, stories about plants that you may be very familiar with, things like walnuts and lots of our different food plants, things like cashews that are very familiar to people, and talks a little bit about the sort of injurious side of those plants, or the parts of the plants that maybe we're not interacting with on a daily basis that can cause rashes or maybe cut us or can be poisonous, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. And so for the multisensory side, I always think of, besides your sight, that you can touch and smell. I don't think there's any tasting though, right, Susan?
There's definitely no tasting, although we definitely do highlight a lot of food plants. And so you can, in your own time, go and taste those plants on your own, but we don't have tastings in the exhibit. There are other, experiential aspects of it. Certainly, there's a really fun part of the exhibit that allows people to sort of test their speed against the speed of several different carnivorous plants. People often think of plants as being very slow moving, so slow that you really can't even see their movement. But that's really not true for a lot of plants, and especially the carnivorous plants that have active traps. And so there's a great interactive for people to come and see how fast they are compared to a few different carnivorous plants.
Cool. And would you say this is for all ages, or 5 and up, or what do you think the age range really is?
I mean, I think it's really for everybody. I think everybody can find, something of interest in there. Even, very young kids, there's really fun cactus seating. You can sit on top of a cactus plant. It's safe. There's no spines, but it looks like there are spines. So that's kind of exciting, and all the way up to the people who might be interested to learn about the different chemicals that are, in plants that we use maybe for medicine, but that are toxic and have evolved in those plants to defend themselves.
And I think it's a great exhibit to go to on a, say, not so nice day when it's rainy or cold out. You have the conservatory to warm up in, and you can drag your non-plant friends in for a little bit of fun, because sometimes it's hard. I love that you added a new sign on the back of the U.S. Botanic Garden that says plants this way. I love that. But there might be some people who are like, plants, whatever. But this might attract them.
Yeah, I love that sign as well. We've gotten a lot of really great feedback about that particular sign. I think this exhibit really has something for everybody. For those really nerdy plant lovers like myself, there's a lot of really great in-depth information, but also for people who just love to see, beauty. There's some really wonderful design elements that I love. There is a sort of a wallpaper that we had designed for this exhibit that features many of the plants in the exhibit. And I love it so much that I'm probably going to order some for my house, like to have my bathroom in this beautiful plant motif. And then also there are several cases where we collected plants from around the garden and elsewhere, and have put them into these cases in a very beautiful way, really showing the dry parts of these different plants to help tell the story about Fierce Flora. And then finally, there are 3 sort of selfie opportunities that you can stand in front of a board that has all of these different plant parts in it that, again, are very artfully arranged to take a selfie with some of these plants, including poison ivy being one of those and Jimsonweed being another one.
Always important to have the selfie station.
Definitely.
I was going to ask you about that wallpaper as well, because I found it very beautiful. So when you put in an order, contact me, because I want to put in an order too.
Absolutely. The shop is considering carrying some of it, and they actually they've used that wallpaper to make a lot of different products. So I already have my Fierce Flora sticker on my water bottle, for example, that has that beautiful wallpaper.
Hmm. It's very, for those visitors who can't picture it, I shared some pictures on our Instagram, and I know the USBG on their Instagram and social media has some, but we'll maybe share a few more on our social media when this episode comes out so people can picture that wallpaper and the exhibit itself. One of the taglines for the exhibit is, "It's a plant's world, we're just living in it." So I love that tagline, and that's so true because there's such pervasive green blindness out there, and we think of it as a human's world, but we are so wrong.
Yeah, and I think honestly, the selfie stations that we created, the sort of educational mission of those is really to help people be able to identify these plants that, if they come into contact with them in nature, or I mean, and even in cities, certainly it might be problematic for them. So poison ivy is a great example of that, where often I see poison ivy growing throughout Washington D.C. in very urban settings at metro station entrances, along fences that are leaning over pathways, that sort of thing. And it would really behoove people to be able to identify it so that they're not touching it. I've seen a lot of people just sort of running their hand along a fence line that has lots of different vines growing in it, some of those vines being poison ivy. And so these selfie stations and the sort of arrangement of the different parts of the plant are really there so that people can start recognizing these plants and in some cases avoiding them.
Hmm. Yeah, I've seen poison ivy popping up in local dog parks of all places. And yeah, ID is super important. And I think one of the things about the exhibit probably want to stress is we don't want people to be afraid of plants, but maybe respect them.
Oh, absolutely. And, big part of this exhibit is really helping people understand, sort of from the plant perspective, why these different compounds and different structures have evolved. It turns out that we use a lot of poisonous compounds as medicines and very effective in treating, different diseases for people. But the plants have evolved them for other kinds of defenses, usually, often against microorganisms, but sometimes against other, plants to inhibit growth of other plants, that sort of thing, or other fungi in some cases. And so, yeah, we talk about sort of the benefits of these compounds in the case of the poisonous compounds to both people and also to the plants themselves. And then the physical defenses of plants, similarly, I think most people can understand, why a cactus has spines on it. It's to protect the water that's stored inside of it from the animals that might want to tear that plant apart to get to the water stored in there. And there's lots of other really interesting physical defenses that plants have. Sometimes those physical defenses are actually combined also with chemical defenses.
Hmm. So let's talk about some of those spiny plants that you were just referring to and the differences between a spine, a spike, or a thorn, or a prickle, and defining those.
Yeah, so there's three major categories of spiky things on plants, and so the first is a spine, and a spine is a modified leaf. And it's typically going to be either the whole leaf that's modified into a spine, which is the case with cactus, or a portion of the leaf, like the stalk of the leaf, which is called the petiole, that's modified into a spine. And we see that mostly in tropical plants, where the blade kind of falls off and the petiole becomes, very pointy and sharp. So spine, modified leaf. Thorn is another kind of pointy thing that we find on plants. And thorns are modified branches, they're modified stem. And so therefore, they're typically going to be woody. And that's one way to identify them. So something like honey locust that we have a lot of here in DC and really the entire eastern United States, where it has those big woody thorns, those are truly thorns. So the things that we have on roses are not thorns at all. So every rose does not have its thorn. Instead, those little structures on roses are called prickles. And a prickle is essentially modified epidermal tissue. So it's a projection from the epidermis. And how we can identify these things as different from each other is you would see a spine or a thorn on the location on the plant where you would normally see a leaf or a stem. And again, thorns are going to be woody. So that's another way to distinguish them from a spine. And then the prickles are going to be just randomly scattered about the surface. And a rose is a really good example of prickle.
Mm. And on prickly pear, which kind of the name kind of gives it away, or opuntia, so I've noticed it has spines, every few inches or so, kind of like in a diamond pattern. But when you touch the fruit or anything else with your bare hand, you're left with these tiny, tiny little hairs almost. And with those are more prickles.
So there's a special name for those, and those are called glochids. And yeah, they're really found in Cactaceae, in the cactus family, but particularly in the subfamily that prickly pear is in. And so these glochids are basically their spines are probably modifications of leaf tissue, but they are hair-like. And I think, I've seen them being formed. They're usually formed. You find them at the base of a spine, but sometimes they'll kind of cover the top of of a cactus, etc. So, but they are called glochids, and those are the nastiest things because they are tiny. They're glass-like. They get in your skin, and you can't really see them. You can just feel them.
Yeah, I was going to say you definitely feel them afterwards, but
Yes.
with the naked eye, you probably don't see them, and they're so tiny and hair-like that you might even think that they're not sharp or going to stick to you. They might be like more fluffy or anything.
Yeah, absolutely. And in some cases, you can get little hairs, or in some cases, the glochids might actually even have some barbing on their surface as well. This is particularly true of, actually, you can also see this in spines and in some cases in thorns, where there'll be sort of downward facing barbs that are all along the surface of the pointy structure itself. So then once it gets in you, pulling it back out becomes much more painful. If you think of something like a fish hook, where it has that little extra barb in it, where it doesn't pull out, imagine hundreds and hundreds of those barbs along the surface.
Fun. Yeah.
Really fun. One of my, I don't know if I'm going to say favorite, but most fascinating of the sort of pointy, stabby things are actually hairs. And there's a lot of really different plant hairs that can cause, pain from just kind of stabbing inside into your skin. Again, a lot of times you really can't see these things, but probably the most fascinating of the sort of stabby hairs are in the stinging nettle family and a couple of different genera, but in the Urtica genus in particular, where they have a very pointy hair, but that hair is actually hollow. And at the base of that hollow hair, there's a swelling. And inside of that swelling, there might be an irritating compound. And so what happens is the hair will actually kind of stab into you. Typically, when it does that, the little tip of it, again, it's hollow, will break off. And it also will push down into that lower portion of the hair, filling the hair with that liquid and injecting it into your skin. And then you now have this glass-like hair stuck in you, but also you've been injected with a compound that makes you extra itchy.
So it's almost like a needle or a stinger on an insect.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. It's like being injected.
So interesting adaptation. And so let's talk about some of those things on seeds that are similar. They're kind of like burrs or have a little, like you said, a fish hook or something that sticks to you. And I would say that's their survival feature so that the seed can be dispersed or spread around. And usually you're not injured by these things, except for I'm thinking of some of those kind of like devil's claw type plants where if you stepped on it, it wouldn't be so pleasant. And also thinking of, some of the tree seeds that are like, barbed balls and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many and they have different functions. And so in some cases, as you said, the function is going to be to disperse the seed. And the idea there is that it would get tangled in an animal's fur. And the animal would carry it away sometimes to great distances until it was so irritated by it that it, sort of scratched it off or it just naturally fell off as the hairs fell out. So that's one thing, is that for dispersal. And then another is for defense again, where if you think of something like chestnut, where it has this sort of bract that's outside of the seeds that's covered in these very spiky structures, that one will open up once the seeds are mature. But prior to them being mature, you'd have to go through all of those really nasty spikes to get to that delicious seed on the inside. So, it's to the advantage of the plant's reproduction to allow for that seed to fully mature on the plant before any animal is trying to get at it.
Yeah, because this is the season, the time of year where you're seeing the sweet gum balls and ginkgo seed or fruit drop on the ground. And of course, my favorite, which is the green brains of the Osage orange tree.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so those are fun. And that has tiny little hairs on it too, but I don't find those to be harmful at all, just a little sticky.
Yeah, not so much. And I will just add one other thing about the sort of burrs that stick in fur. And I think this is something that's pretty well known, but that those were the original inspiration for the creator of Velcro. He was inspired by kind of tearing these burrs off of himself and off of, his dog as they walked through the forest, and realized that this sort of entanglement maybe could be reproduced, and that's why we have Velcro today.
Mm-hmm. And they are sure sticky.
Yeah, they really are.
So let's talk about defenses against herbivores. And I love that vocabulary term. So herbivore, any creature that eats plants, basically.
Yeah, that's right. Herbivores and omnivores both eat plants. So herbivore just eats plants, and omnivores eat sort of all kinds of different things. But yeah, there's a lot of defenses. So certainly some of the things that we've already been talking about, the thorns and prickles and trichomes and spines, are going to be physical defenses against herbivory. There's also quite a bit of chemical defense that happens in plants. And so I think one of the things that people often notice in the springtime, or even in the conservatory as they're walking around with our tropical plants, they'll see, a new flush of leaves on our cinnamon tree, and they're bright red. And people often ask, like, why are those young leaves red? And well, the reason that those young leaves are red is because they're increasing their anthocyanins in their leaves as part of their defense mechanism. So they're increasing chemical production in the young leaves when they're the most tender and don't have a lot of physical defenses. The plant has extra chemical defenses in those leaves to prevent, or at least decrease, herbivory of the young tender leaves as they're growing.
Yeah, and I've noticed a lot of plant breeders are bringing out the anthocyanins in the leaves to make a more dark burgundy or almost black leaf plants, because that's more fashionable now. But it seems like a lot fewer insects or even deer are eating those plants because of those dark leaves. So could be used as defense. Pick those dark leaf plants if you don't want as much. But if you're looking to benefit wildlife, so say you want to benefit your birds and insects, then you want to go to the green side of things.
That's absolutely right. And I would say, on balance, if there hasn't been research done on nativars, or sort of the cultivars of native plants, about how much benefit they can have to the environment, it's always better to go with the wild type for these, for native plants, so that you're getting the benefit to the environment, both from the perspective of being a host for different organisms, and providing seed primarily and fruit to animals.
GardenDC will be back after this short break.
RH, quer saber como voar no trabalho? É só usar a Flash. Com a Flash, você concentra toda a gestão de pessoas em um único lugar. Faça a admissão dos colaboradores e solicite mais de 8 categorias de benefícios. Ah, e você ainda pode fazer todo o controle de ponto. Conheça o novo onboarding integrado da Flash em flashapp.com.br.
Get low-maintenance alternatives to lawns with Ground Cover Revolution by Kathy Jentz. Reducing the lawn is among the biggest trends in homeownership, with an endless stream of homeowners looking for an eco-friendly alternative to a traditional turfgrass lawn. In the last few years alone, over 23 million Americans converted part of their lawn to a natural landscape, and now they're looking to do even more. The biggest challenge to adopting this new ideal of the perfect lawn? Knowing how and when to replace your turf, and which plants are the best ones for the job. Ground Cover Revolution is here with all the answers you need, and some you didn't even know you needed. Included are 40 in-depth profiles of plants that are perfect choices for replacing a grass lawn. There are options for sun, for shade, for dry and wet sites, and for various climates around the globe. There are choices that bloom, options that are evergreen, and selections that are deer-resistant. Kathy Jentz has also included an incredibly useful chart that gives you all the specifics on each of the 40 choices for quick reference and to make your ground cover selection process even easier. Whether you want to replace the entire lawn or just reduce the amount of land dedicated to turf, Ground Cover Revolution will help you usher in a new and improved idea of what a beautiful lawn should be. Ground Cover Revolution is available now wherever you buy books, including Amazon.com and Bookshop.org.
So we talked about how plants defend themselves a little bit against animals or humans, but what about other plant competitors? How do they outcompete each other?
Yeah, so one of the really fun cases that's in the exhibit is a black walnut case where we have all kinds of different structures from black walnut that are all displayed, again, really artfully displayed in a beautiful case. And the reason that that plant is in the exhibit is because black walnuts and many other plants are able to produce compounds that they release into the soil that inhibit the growth of other plants. And so in the case of black walnut, it has this chemical called julone that is being put into the soil, and it will inhibit the growth of other plants all around it. So when you see a black walnut tree growing, you typically don't see any plants growing under that tree.
And that's another vocabulary term for this episode, which is allelopathy or allelopathic.
Yes, that's right. It's allelopathic. Yeah, and so the black walnut is a native plant, and this is part of the sort of environment that it is evolved in. The other organisms have evolved in concert with black walnut. Sometimes we unfortunately have invasive species of plants that also are allelopathic, and that can really wreak havoc on the environment because in some cases they may spread throughout an area and really start inhibiting either the growth of the plants or in some cases the growth of the mycorrhizal fungi, which of course are the fungi that connect to the root systems of the plants in the forest and help with nutrient exchange and in some cases signaling as well.
And let's talk next about the carnivorous plants that we referred to earlier. So there are from the Venus flytraps to bladderworts, there's the pitcher plants, and they're not usually human eating or any danger to us, but they are so fascinating.
Oh, they really are. I mean, these are some of the most charismatic, plants that we have. There are over 600 carnivorous plants that have evolved globally, and there are certainly some families of plants that are entirely carnivorous, but there also are families of plants that have evolved carnivory within them. So things like the bromeliads, for example, there are little hairs that have evolved in some bromeliads that allow them to, these are the tank plants is one of the common names for bromeliads. They sort of hold water at the bases of their leaves. And so they've evolved these little hairs that allow them to absorb nutrients from the water that's gathered at the base of their leaves. But there's so many wonderful mechanisms for carnivory. There are many different lineages have evolved pitchers, a pitcher form. Usually it's going to be a modified leaf that holds water, entirely is able to hold water within it. In some cases, those pitcher plants are creating their own digestive enzymes that they have in this liquid pool that they're able to digest the insects and the other organisms that fall inside of them. In some cases, they're relying on the sort of other organisms inhabiting these little pools of water and to assist with the breakdown or to entirely be responsible for the breakdown of the organisms that fall within it. And then the plant's able to absorb those nutrients. And again, pitcher plants have evolved in many different lineages, and they're found in all kinds of different habitats. So we have the genus Sarracenia and the genus Darlingtonia here in the United States. So Darlingtonia is on the west coast in California, and Sarracenia, the eastern pitcher plants. There's many different species of them. They're just beautiful, lovely plants. But there's also tropical ones like Nepenthes that we find, throughout sort of the Pacific and in Asia. They all have a similar mechanism. As I said, some digest their own, some depend on other organisms. Some don't just digest insects that fall in, but some are specialists on using the poo of animals. So there's a great story about a Nepenthes that's evolved to essentially function as a bathroom for a shrew that will sort of perch on top of it and lick a little nectar field that it has on the hood above the pitcher. And then it will, poop in the pitcher plant. And the pitcher will use that for a source of nitrogen. There are some that provide a roosting area for bats, and then the bats will deposit guano in them. There's lots of really interesting different things that have evolved within pitcher plants. And then, of course, we have the active trap carnivorous plants, things like the Venus flytrap, which is maybe one of the most charismatic plants there is. People often think of the Venus flytrap being an exotic plant, some sort of tropical, mysterious plant. But in fact, it is endemic to, which means found nowhere else than the Carolinas. It's in North and South Carolina, native to those areas, endemic to them, only found from there. And so it's a local hero. So Venus flytrap's really fascinating active trap. There's 3 trigger hairs on each side of the trap, which is a modified leaf. And you have to trigger 2 of those hairs within about 16 seconds of each other in order for the trap to close. And then it closes pretty rapidly. And then again, here the plant's going to release some digestive enzymes and break down the soft parts of the insect that it has trapped. And then the dried up exoskeleton will sort of blow away when the trap opens up again. And then one of my favorite carnivorous plants is Utricularia. It's also called Bladderwort. And we have some really great videos of Bladderwort in the exhibit, and that the interactive that I told you about, where you're testing your speed against these different carnivorous plants, Bladderwort is on that interactive, and those traps will close within 1/1000th of a second when they're triggered, and they are traps that are found in water. They're going to be trapping little invertebrates that are swimming around in the water around them.
And I can imagine they have to be very quick. I mean, even Venus flytrap, to catch a fly, if you've ever hunted around trying to hit one with a fly swatter, you know that they're not slow.
Yes, so true.
Yeah. So you need to get them. And most of these carnivorous plants, or so-called carnivorous plants, they're using this as a nutrient substitute because they're growing usually in soils that are depleted of nutrients.
That's correct. So this carnivory has evolved multiple times, and it's always in relation to an adaptation for compensating for nutrient-poor soils, or for plants that are not rooted in soils, but instead are climbing plants or really attached to other plants, and so they're getting their nutrients from them. Some people think, they're feeding themselves. Plants feed themselves through photosynthesis, so that's how they make their sugars. So they get their energy through photosynthesis, but they are getting their nutrients. So it's sort of like you taking a vitamin in the morning versus having breakfast.
Yeah, that's a great distinction to make, because I can't stand those commercials that say feed your plants with fertilizer. I'm like, they're feeding themselves. Or just give them a little vitamin boost there.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about poisonous plants, or toxic might be a better term. So those are plants that if we took a bite of the leaf, or if an animal did, you might become sick. You probably won't die from most of them, but it's not going to be a pleasant experience.
Yeah. And I'll say, poisonous is always very relative, right? There's a lot of things that we consume regularly. I mean, daily even. Caffeine is a great example of that, mm-hmm. right? So that we consume caffeine, the vast majority of us, in very healthy, levels. Some of us get a little too carried away, but caffeine in extremely high doses is fatal, right? So it's all about the dosing, and some compounds, it has a much lower dose that would be causing issues for people versus something like caffeine, where we can take quite a bit of it in without having massively negative impacts on us. So it really is all about the dosage. And a lot of the plants that we think of as poisonous plants may also be, very helpful plants from a medicinal standpoint. And I think foxglove is a really good example of that. Many people have foxglove in their gardens, and they are a beautiful plant, certainly, but they are also very poisonous. You would never want to eat foxglove, but they're also a really important medicinal plant as well. We get heart medication from foxgloves. People think of, sort of natural medicine as being this something that's always very safe. I used to teach in a herbal medicine program, and I one time had a student who had heart issues, and she said, I have this heart medication that comes from foxglove, but I really want to just make my own tea. That feels a lot more safe to me. And I, had to explain to her that the dosage is really extremely important. And if you're making a tea, controlling that dosage is very, very difficult, and likely would go in a direction that she just certainly did not want it to go in. So it's all about the dosage. Toxicity is really relative, but all of these compounds typically have evolved in plants, as I said, to defend the plants against other organisms. And we've sort of discovered that they can be very beneficial to us. And there's so many good stories about poisonous plants, interesting stories from history, but also certainly the great medications that we've been able to develop from some of these poisonous plants.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the story about Datura, Jimsonweed. Do you know that one about the British troops
Yes.
getting a little too much of a dose of Jimsonweed, and that helping the American Revolution?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, the sort of people in Jamestown serving the British troops, Jimsonweed tea and getting them off their game quite a bit. So yeah, it's a plant that we see actually comes up as a weed all over DC. I see it pretty often. It's a beautiful plant, but not one, again, that you really want to necessarily make a tea out of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and something you definitely want to have an ID on because, it's usually pretty easy to identify once it's up and growing. Very interesting tropical leaves and kind of has a spike on the end and then forms those balls and a big trumpet-like flower. But when it's a tiny seedling, you wouldn't want to accidentally pick some and put it in your salad.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, no, that would be really bad. That would cause all kinds of, heart issues and other complicating issues with your various digestive and other systems in your body. But it is a plant that if you come to the exhibit, you can take a selfie with different parts of it that are in a very safe selfie station, but also you can learn how to identify it from those images as well.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about some of the other plants that we've made modern medicine with. And I was thinking about colchicine in particular. I want to say the autumn crocus is one of the sources. I think it's used in a heart medication.
Yeah, colchicine actually stops cells from dividing and growing, which is fascinating. And it's used to treat gout and some fevers.
Yep, very interesting effect. And I would say, most times when you're looking at adding a houseplant to your household and you have a cat or a dog or maybe even a toddler who likes to chew on things, you're going to look up whether it's toxic or not. So your point about the dosage is a good one because so many plants are rated as toxic, but just a little nibble is not going to affect you.
Yeah, no, that's so true. And, I get questions a lot from people about wanting to identify a plant that maybe, their child touched or ate, a bit into a leaf, something like that. And yeah, the dosage is really, really important. I think you mentioned cats. The organism is extremely important as well. So something that actually is edible to people, something like a daylily, which we can eat most parts of the daylily, the flower, underground parts, etc. Those are actually fatal to cats, and there is no treatment. It causes any true lilies. If your cat ate a true lily, it causes kidney failure, and there is no treatment for it.
Yeah, so those ones you want to be super cautious, obviously with lilies and cats. And then I was thinking about all the misinformation about poinsettias.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and we're getting into that time of year when this is really going to be in the media again and on people's minds as there's going to be poinsettias available all over the place at grocery stores and nurseries and whatnot. And yeah, people will often say, poinsettias are toxic. And certainly there is a low level of toxicity. If you were going to eat a poinsettia plant, I would not recommend that. I also don't recommend you breaking off the parts and rubbing the milky exudate on your skin or in your eyes or anything like that. But having one in your house is quite safe. They are very low toxicity in those plants, and they are very safe. I think another one that gets another group of plants that gets a lot of attention from a sort of misinformation standpoint are aroids. And aroids have become so popular, I think, especially since the pandemic, with the sort of massive increase in interest in growing exotic, different cultivars, rare cultivars of different aroids. Every member of the aroid family has compounds in them that if you bit into them, then you would feel sort of the spiky burning sensation in all of the sort of soft parts of your mouth. People will, if you look them up, or if you ask, if you Google the sort of toxicity of these plants, they'll see don't have them around pets, etc. But it would be extremely rare for a child or a pet to continue eating an aroid because it is so uncomfortable from the very first bite. And so typically they'll take a single bite and they'll let it go because of the compounds sort of stabbing them in the mouth. And those are calcium oxalate crystals primarily is what those are.
So all of those oxalate family things. So you're thinking about some of the things that make things sour and have oxalate compounds in them. Not the greatest thing to eat in large quantities, but they kind of make a interesting sensation, right? They make your mouth kind of pucker or water.
Yeah, they do. And so there's quite a few plants that do, that will have that sort of, it's almost like a lemony sour taste where the kind of the back of your tongue and the sides of your tongue get really triggered. And yeah, eating some of those and not massive doses is absolutely fine. And there are quite a few foods, especially in South America, that are developed from plants that have those compounds. But calcium oxalate crystals are a little bit different than oxalic acid, where the oxalic acid, it's going to be a chemical response that you feel where it's sour. Some people really have a strong reaction to it. We were actually in the garden last week, and there was a plant that people were sort of tasting. That was a sorrel that people were tasting, and one person spit it out immediately and had just a very negative reaction because her taste receptors were telling her, "Get this, this is poison, get this out." And everybody else was like, "Oh, this is delicious," and have a little bit more of it. But those calcium oxalate crystals that you see in aroids, those are a physical response that your body's having. They're essentially just they're literally stabbing into your soft tissues, and so everybody has a negative reaction to those. I don't think anybody who's like, "Oh, I love the stabbing sensation in my gums and lips and tongue,"
Yep. And I was going to compare that to hot peppers. So I think we might be the only mammal that likes to eat hot peppers, but I always thought of the hot pepper capsicum as a defense for that plant.
Yeah, and so the hot in peppers is from capsaicin, which is the compound that that we very much can sense in our mouths, but some of us really, really love that sensation, and it's odorless and it's colorless, but we can really feel it in our mouths. And where people evolved and where those plants evolved to sort of in concert is in Central and South America. So all hot peppers are from sort of Mexico south into northern South America, and they've become really essential components of global cuisine all the way around the world. But the Thai peppers that you may love in your Thai food, those are American peppers, and all of them are. So yeah, really interesting that we think of peppers and different types of hot peppers as being associated with different cuisines all over the globe. And this is true of lots of plants, like tomatoes, for example. I think of tomatoes as being so important for Italian cuisine here in the United States. But in fact, tomatoes are also from the Americas. And so we're not part historically of Italian cuisine, but certainly are now.
And now that you bring up tomatoes, we have to talk about the history and how, they were perceived as poisonous, the fruits and the plants. But of course, we don't want to eat a tomato leaf today.
Yeah. So, interestingly, the tomatoes, eggplants, potatoes, peppers, they're all in the Nightshade family, the Solanaceae. And I would say, on balance, that's a pretty toxic family. Also, actually, Jimsonweed is also in that family, interestingly enough. So on balance, pretty toxic family. There's quite a few nasty, highly poisonous members of the family, including things like the deadly nightshade. But we also, as I mentioned, have lots of different cultivated plants within the family that are quite edible. And it's important to know which part of the plant is edible. There's lots of, sort of cases from history of people thinking a plant is edible, and they're eating the wrong part. I think a plant is edible, that means the entire plant is edible, when in a lot of cases, only part of the plant is edible. There's a spring ephemeral that we have called mayapple, or sometimes some people call it regionally maypop. And mayapple is a poisonous plant. You really don't want to eat that plant except for the ripe fruit. When the fruit is ripe, it's quite delicious, totally edible. The rest of that plant, you don't want to eat it. Do not eat it.
I'm thinking similarly of pokeweed, American pokeweed as well.
Great example. Absolutely right. Yeah, you really don't want to eat pokeweed except for when it's really young, and you still at that point really have to process it.
Mm-hmm. And I think in your exhibit you referred to the cashew tree as well, maybe in that same category of knowing what to eat.
Yes, absolutely. So cashew is in the same family as poison ivy. Also, mangoes and pistachios are in that family as well. And cashew, the seed is edible. Of course, we eat the seed. There's also a vegetative part that people often think of as the fruit in the tropics. It's actually what's called a hypocarp. It's essentially the stalk of the fruit that becomes swollen and fleshy and very juicy. And that's actually the part of the plant that is the dispersal mechanism. It's the thing that animals want to eat. I've seen videos of primates, monkeys picking these fruits. They'll eat that hypocarp. It's called the cashew apple. Or often, like if you have like cashew juice or cashew juice, it's usually the juice from this hypocarp. But monkeys will pull it off the tree, eat the fleshy part, and then kind of throw away the true fruit, which has the seed inside of it. And the whole surrounding part of the fruit, not the seed, but everything around the seed, is toxic and will give you a rash. If you eat it, you would get a rash on your mouth and your hand, hands anywhere you touched it. Again, it's related to poison ivy, and those compounds, those urushiol, are present in resin canals throughout that fruit body and really throughout the whole plant. So the leaves have it, the stem, every part of the plant has those compounds except for that seed and except for that hypocarp.
And I'm glad you brought up rashes, because I wanted to bring up that and allergens that are caused by plants. But I'm thinking of course, you mentioned poison ivy, but giant hogweed and others where you're touching the plant and maybe you don't get a rash right that second. It might be hours later that something develops, or it's because it's exposed to sunlight after you've touched the plant.
Yeah, and these are the really fascinating ones where, there's, I think there's kind of two categories there. So one is where you have a delayed reaction. I think people are probably familiar with that with poison ivy, right? Most people are not going to get a poison ivy rash within like an hour or two of them touching the plant. It's going to be typically, days later, sometimes up to 2 weeks later, a rash can appear after contact with poison ivy. But really fascinating thing is when you have to have some other kind of exposure to something, whether, often it's sunlight that will sort of trigger that reaction to give you that rash. And I think one that I see the most is with lime. So if you are, if you're having a party and you're making a whole bunch of margaritas and you're hand squeezing those limes, so you get lime juice all over your hands, and maybe you're, hanging out in your yard and you're getting, so sun and this lime, you can get kind of a really nasty rash all over your hands from the combination of the lime juice and the sunlight. So those combination reactions are really fascinating to me. You mentioned giant hogweed. That's, really, it kind of can be a really nasty rash. And that is another one of those, which is called phytophotodermatitis, which means that it has to have contact with the plant. That's the phyto. And then also with sun, that's the photo. And then the dermatitis is the rash. So phytophotodermatitis. And for hogweed, that can result in some really nasty, huge blisters, lots of swelling. You can get some really dark scarring. Dark scarring is usually what you see with the lime juice one, as I mentioned as well. And it can really cause, extenuated sort of sensitivity to sunlight as well. So yeah, giant hogweed's one to avoid. And that, as you mentioned, can also take place, a couple of days after contact as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So be careful, wear gloves. ID is probably the most important thing, knowing what a giant hogweed looks like and not just pulling it out randomly.
Absolutely. I mean, being able to identify, especially just some of the commonly encountered plants is really, really important. But something that I always say is if you don't know what it is in nature, don't assume that it's safe. People often think like, oh, nature's so safe. And, there's a chemical, war that's going on all around us when we're in nature. And nature is, I would, definitely explore it, enjoy it. For the most part, it's safe, but don't assume that you can, tear up a plant that's next to you to feel it or to eat it, for goodness sakes. Or, I've certainly heard lots of stories about people going to the bathroom in nature and using leaves for toilet paper and all sorts of horror stories associated with that you can imagine.
Yeah. Leave that to the listener's imagination there. Thank you, Susan, so much for sharing about Fierce Flora and the new exhibit that people can explore and do some side research on their own. And how can listeners find out more or contact you?
Yeah, so really the best place to start is on our website. So that's usbg.gov. And we've got lots of great information there, including how you can get directly in contact with us through our plant hotline. We have an email address, usbg@aoc.gov for the plant hotline. But again, you can find that on our website, or if you just do a search for U.S. Botanic Garden and Plant Hotline. And that is really a resource for the public to be able to send us their plant questions, whether that's how do I grow my tomatoes, or I've got these funny spots on them, or hey, is this poison ivy? You can send descriptions, pictures, all questions are welcome on the Plant Hotline. And then you can definitely connect with us on social media. It's U.S. Botanic Garden on Facebook, Instagram, and also on YouTube. And we also are looking to expand our volunteer corps. We're always looking for wonderful volunteers, both in our learning and engagement team and also in our horticulture team. And you can learn more about our volunteer program and apply at on our website, usbg.gov/volunteer.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Susan.
Yeah, thanks so much.
GardenDC will be back after this short break.
Olha o contra-ataque aí, vem que vem o time avançando rápido pela meio de campo. Bola dominada no pé do camisa 10. Ele vai pra cima, passou pelo primeiro, passou pelo segundo. Invadiu a grande área, vai chutar. Bateu, é gol! Que golaço, minha gente!
A experiência de futebol mais autêntica já criada para os games. Junte-se no 5x5 Rush, a nova maneira de jogar com os amigos e leve seu clube para a vitória. EA Sports FC 25. Dê tudo pelo clube. Já disponível.
In the book The Urban Garden by Kathy Jentz and Terry Spate, you'll find dozens of inspiring and creative ways to grow flowers, shrubs, vegetables, herbs, and other plants in small spaces and with a limited budget. Whether you want to grow on a balcony, rooftop, front stoop, or a tiny urban patio, turn your growing dreams into reality and build a gorgeous and unique garden that showcases your personal style while still being functional and productive. With the ingenious ideas and resourceful tactics found here, you'll be maximizing yields and beauty from every square inch of your space. No matter what you grow, the 101 amazing growing ideas found in the urban garden will turn your tiny urban yard into a treasure trove of green you'll be proud to share with family and friends. Buy your copy today at your local retail bookseller or order it online now at Amazon.com or bookshop.org.
Schlumbergera plant profile. Holiday cactus, Schlumbergera species, are popular houseplants that bloom in winter. The flowers can be white, pink, peach, purple, or red. They are native to the coastal mountains of southeastern Brazil and are hardy in USDA zones 10 to 12. Despite the cactus name, this succulent is native to tropical rainforests, where they grow on tree branches and thrive in high humidity, part sun, and warm temperatures. Note that the Christmas cactus is often confused for the Thanksgiving cactus. The two look very similar. To identify a Christmas cactus, look for more rounded edges on the leaves compared to a Thanksgiving cactus's sharp, pointier edges. In addition, Christmas cactus bloom later than Thanksgiving cacti, typically around midwinter. Most that are available in stores near you are likely the Thanksgiving cactus. You can force the holiday cactus into bloom by placing them in a cool room between 55 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit with 14 hours of darkness each night for at least 6 weeks. Give them a balanced houseplant fertilizer when you water them in the early fall. This also encourages consistent flowering in the winter. When watering, make sure to keep your cactus on the dry side, but not as dry as typical cactus. As the flowers fade, pluck them off to keep the plants looking fresh. You may have received your holiday cactus as a pass-along plant. They're fairly easy to propagate. Pinch off a stem section and put the wounded end in a shallow cup with water in the bottom and place it in a sunny windowsill. After 2 to 3 weeks, it will have formed roots and you can pot it up in soil. Schlumbergera holiday cactus. You can grow that. What's new in the garden this week? Well, I'm loving the color of my pink muhly grass in the sunlight. It is just gorgeous. Over at the community garden plot, we are picking the last of the zucchini and peppers and clearing out any of the remaining summer crops, putting in cover crops, and also applying straw to any open beds that are left for the winter time. In garden tips and tasks this week, on our social media, we shared all about fall planting bulbs for springtime, and those tips included that bulb augers are becoming a popular way to quickly plant a large number of bulbs, so check those out to speed things up, especially if you have heavy compacted soils. And you can force your spring bulbs for indoor blooms in January, February by potting them up now, watering them, and placing them in your vegetable crisper drawer for about 10 weeks to enjoy this winter. And daffodil bulbs can cause contact dermatitis, a rash sometimes called daffodil picker's rash, so you'll want to wear gloves whenever handling them. Our October issue of Washington Gardener magazine is out, and definitely check out the reader contest in that because you have a chance of winning a $100 gift certificate from flowerbulbs.eu. And our cover story is on pretty and predatory pitcher plants. We also have features on houseplant humidity myths, what's killing the arborvitae, a summary of the recent Urban Tree Summit, gardening book reviews, do's and don'ts for mowing in wet conditions, daffodil planting tips, when to water those air plants, a story in our weed column about American pokeweed, and a visit to a local sunflower protest garden, and much more. You can check that out at washingtongardener.blogspot.com. In local gardening events, if you're in the Washington, D.C. area, check out on Friday, November 1st, the Gardener's Focus program on specialty mums at 2:30 p.m. held at Hillwood Estate Museum and Garden. You can find out more about that at hillwoodmuseum.org. And then the following day, Saturday, November 2nd, the Eco Savvy Gardening Fair is taking place at Green Spring Gardens in Alexandria, Virginia from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. There is a $35 attendee fee, and you should register in advance at fairfaxcounty.gov/parks. Seating is limited. I am the keynote speaker for that program, which emphasizes embracing eco-savvy gardening techniques. I'll be talking all about small space and urban gardens. And finally, on Thursday, November 7th, there is a Fall Colors Tram Tour at the U.S. National Arboretum at 10:30 a.m. There is a fee, and you must pre-register at FONA.org. That's FONA, Friends of the National Arboretum.org. Happy gardening.
This is Christy Page with Food Gardening Network with the last word on 12 Things to Grow in Your Greenhouse This Winter by Amanda MacArthur. Fine, I'll admit it. I've been guilty of scrolling through social media admiring those picture-perfect greenhouse lounges. You know the ones, cozy chairs nestled among lush greenery, fairy lights twinkling overhead. It's enough to make anyone dream of sipping hot cocoa in a tropical paradise, even as the snow piles up outside. But here's the thing. While those setups are undeniably cute, I'm more of a fresh tomatoes in January kind of gal. Don't get me wrong, I love a good aesthetic, but for me, the real magic of a greenhouse is in defying nature's rhythms and coaxing life from the soil when the rest of the world has gone dormant. So, if you're ready to trade your greenhouse lounge dreams for a bounty of winter fresh produce, you've come to the right place. Let's dig into 12 edible plants you can grow in your greenhouse this winter, along with some hard-earned wisdom I've gathered along the way. Now, the greenhouse advantage, why winter gardening is worth it. Well, number one, you get an extended growing season. This is a big one. The greenhouse lets you start earlier in spring and keep going long after the first frost. Two is climate control. You're creating a microclimate that can be tailored to your plant's needs. 3, protection from pests and harsh weather. No more battling deer, rabbits, or sudden hailstorms. 4, water conservation. Greenhouses typically require less watering than outdoor gardens. 5, variety. You can grow plants that wouldn't normally thrive in your climate zone. So now let's get to it. What are the 12 edible plants for your winter greenhouse? Well, number 1 is tomatoes. It's a greenhouse superstar because they thrive in the controlled environment. Number 2, leafy greens. They mature quickly and don't require much space. Number 3, herbs. They're great for greenhouses due to their compact size and quick growth. 4, bell peppers. They love warm, consistent temperatures. 5, cucumbers. They also love warm, humid conditions and thrive in greenhouses. 6, strawberries. They can produce fruit year-round in controlled conditions. 7, microgreens. They have a quick turnaround and high nutrient content. 8, carrots. They prefer cooler temperatures and can be grown in containers in your greenhouse. 9, bush beans. They're great for a greenhouse due to their compact size and quick maturity. 10, radishes. They grow rapidly in their cool season in nature. 11. Dwarf citrus trees. They benefit from controlled temperature and humidity. And 12. Ginger. Ginger loves warm, humid environments and is great for growing in greenhouses. Now, maximize your greenhouse space. A few tips. 1. Go vertical. Use trellises, hanging baskets, and vertical planters to maximize your growing space. 2. Use companion planting. Group plants that grow well together. For example, basil planted near tomatoes can improve your flavor into tier pests. 4. Succession planting. When one crop finishes, have seedlings ready to take its place. And 5. Use all levels. Place shade-loving plants under taller sun lovers. Remember, every seed planted is an act of hope, and every harvest is a small miracle. Happy growing, and I hope you enjoy your greenhouses. This has been The Last Word by Christy Page at foodgardening.com.
Thank you for listening to GardenDC. You can become a listener supporter for as little as 99 cents a month by going to the supporter link in our show notes or directly to podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/GardenDC/support. Another way to support this podcast is to subscribe to our monthly digital publication, Washington Gardener Magazine. To do so, go to WashingtonGardener.com or WashingtonGardener.blogspot.com. You can find Washington Gardener on social media at WDC Gardener on Twitter or X, Instagram, and Pinterest, and on Facebook at Washington Gardener Magazine. And be sure to leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform. Please take a minute to share us on social media with #GardenDC so other gardeners can find us too.